And that's why I respect the weapon. You have to give credit where credit is due. And that is a very... Welcome back, folks, to our podcast, Normal versus Mongols. And today we're going to be talking about an underappreciated weapon, or a weapon that doesn't get enough exposure, in my opinion, and that is the mace. Now, a lot of people talk about the Mongolian mace. We're also going to discuss that as well. Obviously, this is Norman versus Mongols. But the Normans also use the mace. And in my opinion, it's a weapon that is that's value isn't discussed as much as I would think. Now, we know as it's a secondary weapon, the primary weapon of the Norman horseman is going to be his lance. If he loses his lance, he's going to pull out his sword or use his mace. So, what advantage does the mace have over the sword or the spear? In comparison, the spear obviously is a longer weapon. So, the spear has the advantage against either the sword or the mace in distance. And in some cases, the mace is a tad shorter than the sword as well. I do believe if you're on horseback, your mace will probably be a tad bit longer. That's just, common sense. But 3 feet of blade was usually about how long the Norman sword was. So very similar to their Viking ancestors and to the Lombard spada that was used. But an advantage the mace has, in my opinion, over the sword is that if you take the mace and you smash it against the helmet or the shield of your opponent, there's no blade for you to worry about blunting or denting. It could take a whole lot of force, or it can give a whole lot of take a whole lot of impact, and without taking any damage to it at all. If your sword, if you smash it against a shield and it doesn't cut the shield right, or it hits up against a rather tough helmet or anything iron, you take the great risk of damaging the edge in the blade of your weapon. So now that's something you have to spend money to repair, and you're trying not to do that. Now, of course, like I said, on the battlefield, if you're in that situation, you really don't care about your precious edge. But if you're on campaign, you're more than likely going to fight more than one battle or more than one skirmish. So you have to take those things into account and into consideration. So the mace is definitely much cheaper than making a sword. It's much easier to maintain than a sword. But does it do as much damage as a sword? Well, this is up for debate. Now, the sword against other Normans is less effective than if you use it against peasants if you're raiding an area. Now, during this period in warfare, especially with the Tancred Brothers, when they were fighting enemies, you would usually attack the weaker targets before attacking the hard ones. When Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger were fighting each other, they did not have any pitched battles where they duked it out. They mostly raided the land of each other. And when you're doing so, you're often attacking peasants, guarding them. You're not really engaging with a lot of soldiers who are professionally trained. So if you take the Norman longsword and as people have tested before, you strike it against butted chainmail, whether you're thrusting or slashing, it's not very effective at piercing it. And then underneath that you have the gambeson and so on. So it does little damage against a good armored opponent and against someone who also knows who's been trained their entire life to take such blows and roll with them and so on. But if you're raiding peasants who are unarmored, it's very much easier to slaughter them. And if you're fighting lightly armored horse cavalry from the Muslims, and your idea is to get in close to them where you can deal them a lot of damage, the sword is very effective, so a mace isn't really needed. Now, if you're fighting a much heavier armored opponent, the mace has a good advantage here, because even though it's not going to pierce the chainmail or pierce the gambeson, the weight of it, the crushing force, can still break bone and cause great damage. You're probably not going to kill that guy if you smash him against his arm, but you're going to be breaking bones and breaking ribs. And yes, the sword is still a piece of metal. A lot of people think if someone has armor on, they get hit with the sword, they're perfectly fine. Well, no, there's still weight to the sword. It's still delivering force to its target. So if you're not dispelling that force, which is what they did later with the way they would design plate armor, it wasn't just a flat piece of metal, because you didn't want it hitting flat against you. You want it to have an angle so that sword could glance off. And the reason why is you don't want that force being transferred to that bone, because even if you have armor on, if you're hit with something heavy enough or hit hard enough with the object, it will still break the bone. So I think against armored opponents, the sword and the mace are, they're pretty equal with the damage they can deal and deliver. Now, the sword is still a tad bit more wieldy, because the sword has the pommel on the end, which is a counterweight, so you're not putting a lot of strain on your wrists. Now, the mace, from what we see in drawings, it doesn't appear to have any counterweight to it, so it's got all the force weighted downward with the smashing, crushing force. Now, if you're on horseback, you're probably not expending as much energy as you smash your opponents. If you're on foot, you're going to be using it in conjunction with the shield. And there are even, in some of the paintings, you see a character carrying the mace and still has a sword. so he could have more than one weapon in that distance. But I do think it's very effective against the type of armored opponents in the area that the Normans will be fighting, because like I said, even though they're not going to be able to pierce the armor, you could do just as much damage, if not more, than you would with a sword against an armored opponent without having to spend as much money as you would on a sword. A mace is much cheaper. It's a piece of wood. It probably has some iron in there just for weight, and covered in beeswax and fire treated, as opposed to a sword, which takes a very long time to make. You need the iron, and you want the iron pure. And when you're finished with the sword, if there's a mistake, you've got to start all over again. So that process has to be done again to make it perfect. Whereas the mace, you pretty much know what you're doing. It's very simple to manufacture. It's a cheap weapon. It's effective, and it does do well against lightly armored opponents. It does perfect. And against even the heavier armor that the Normans or the Byzantines will be wearing, it can still deal as much damage as a sword would against a heavily armored opponent in that sense. Oh, you're still here. Oh, thanks folks for watching this episode of our Norman vs. Mongol podcast, and comment down below which weapon you think is more effective, the mace or the sword. Which one would you prefer to have your warrior? Do you want to use the sword because of its finesse and its nice maneuverability and its willingness, or would you prefer a mace so you could at least smash your opponent open? Thanks for watching. Like the video, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and stay tuned because we have another one coming out next week, and we're having a new series launch this Monday.